Here's another example of making active verbs instead of passive verbs. The original sentence says, whether transduction of U2OS cells with CRISPR-Cas9 baculoviruses resulted in the disruption of the A, B, and C loci was tested. So that's a really long subject and then a passive verb, was tested. So the first thing I would do is make the verb active and give the sentence an agent. We tested whether transduction of U2OS cells, etc. When I do that, I notice that there's a couple of abstract nouns in this sentence, transduction and disruption. And so I convert these abstract nouns to concrete nouns. And it says, now, we tested whether U2OS cells transduced with CRISPR-Cas9 baculoviruses disrupted the ABC loci. So I've taken these abstract nouns and made them into other parts of speech. So transduction becomes transduced, which is part of a modifying phrase describing the cells, and disruption becomes disrupted. And we also went from 22 words down to 17 words. So that's going to improve our readability scores also. All right, so now we've got a couple more steps in this process. So we already looked at steps 1, 2, and 3. Step 4 is to replace abstract nouns with concrete nouns. And step 5 is to replace passive verbs with active verbs. Once you've done these 5 steps, your readability scores will be quite a bit better. So run your writing through the software again and see how it looks. But let's keep going. All right, here's an example, and I'm not going to read this whole thing to you and explain it because, it would just make this video too long and complicated. But I have a paragraph that started off with the flesh reading ease of 8.8, and I applied these techniques that I've just described and got the reading score up to 29.5. So that's almost 30. And we cut it down to 112 words. So why don't you pause the video and read these 2 paragraphs and see what I did to get the readability score up. Now, there are a few more tricks to make writing more readable, and one of these is to make the writing more relatable. So how do you do that? Well, even scientists who are a lot of times introverts, even us as introverts, we can relate to other people. So one way to increase the readability is to add people as much as possible when it's appropriate, and not just people, but add agents to your sentences. I talked about that already in the examples that we looked at previously about taking a sentence that has no agent and making an agent in that sentence. It might not be a person. It could be a person. So some tips to do that are, do change third person unidentified agents to first person with an identified agent. And first person may not have an actual person there. Some don'ts are, don't just add "we found that" in front of your results. So sometimes I see that, and that's really not a good way to do it. It makes your sentences 3 words longer, and it's just artificially adding an agent. And also, don't do it by using author names as the subjects of sentences. And we'll talk about that in a later lesson. Let's look at an example of changing a third-person unidentified agent sentence into a first-person sentence. So this sentence says, different hypotheses could be initially considered in order to explain the absence of chromosome segregation defects in SAC mutants during the normal growth of S. cerevisiae. So what I did is I just changed it to put a person as an agent. We initially considered. The first version, it just said different hypotheses could be considered. We don't know who is considering these different hypotheses. It just says they could be considered. Could be considered by who? Now, if this is in the context of a paper, it's pretty obvious that it's the authors who are considering these different hypotheses. So why not just say that? We initially considered different hypotheses. And that's how I would suggest changing this sentence. I also took out a couple of words in order to explain. I just changed it to explain. You don't need the in order part of that phrase. Here are two more examples. No significant difference in the rate of sulfate consumption was observed between AQDS plus and AQDS minus reactors during this phase. All right, so let's think about that. No significant difference was observed. So who was observing it? We could easily say we found no significant difference in the rate of sulfate consumption. Now we've acknowledged that it is us. The second example, it was expected that detectable gene diversity would be considerably lower than organismal diversity. It was expected by who? By us, the authors. We expected that detectable gene diversity would be considerably lower. And this one is a simple one. When comparing overall peering rates, there were no differences. Just change that to when comparing overall peering rates, we found no differences. That one's simple. It doesn't change the number of words, but it does make the sentence more relatable and more active. As I mentioned, you don't want to accomplish this by simply adding "we found that" in front of results. For example, we found that tree mortality was present in all of the 10 top performing models, with these 10 models containing tree mortality having a combined model weight of 80%. If you just take out the "we found that," that sentence is the same. So "we found that" is not important in the sentence, and I would advise you not to include it. All right, now we have two more steps in the process. So step 6 is add people or agents when possible and appropriate. And now we're going to look at step 7. Make your sentences shorter by using concise wording.